whether it's stylishly making an argument for some real-world conflicts and ideas, or prioritizing certain emotional beats using the techniques at hand for the benefit of your own personal engagement with the subject. All types of media attempt to manipulate you to some extent. The reason Violet Evergarden is an interesting example of manipulative techniques in media is because of the degree to which it is deliberately manipulating us in favour of what is actually quite a basic story, and extremely effectively at that.
お客様がお望みならどこでも駆けつけます。自動手記人形サービスバイオレットエバーガーデンです。
The first thing everyone notices is just how pretty this anime looks, as if holding themselves accountable for the high expectations one might gather, having learnt that the production studio behind this is none other than Kyoto Animation. They charge in with animation almost unrivaled amongst TV format anime. The trifecta of immersive and living animation in the movement of characters, their interactions with the environment, and their connection to the background art are qualities that contribute to a sense of realism that Kyoto is thoroughly exercising their expertise in with Violet Evergarden. By replicating certain live-action cinematic aesthetics, they lay a foundation for that realism, utilising digital overlays to create realistic tones and mimicking how a camera might capture light and colour in each carefully composed shot. Add to that detailed depictions of realistic motion and movement of characters and objects makes this anime, and by extension Kyoto Animation, deserving of their good reputation. There's just a consistency in the overall level of visual quality here that you'd find hard to come by anywhere else. You might expect the replication of in-camera effects to take away from the realism, but paradoxically it actually enhances it by connecting to our ingrained knowledge of seeing light and colour behave in certain ways in the middle of live-action scenes. It actually ends up being the most perfect example of this aesthetic, as they are only pretending to be within the limitations of what live-action technology would capture, and any inaccuracies can be controlled and refined to any degree to fit any purpose.
ここにいたの。
中佐。
見えてきたね。ライデンの港。
Hair and clothing are just two highlights of what Evergarden has to offer, always holding the illusion of multiple layers, swishing in the wind, squishing against force, or better yet, carrying the momentum of each movement down to a single step, which by itself has an amazing sense of weight. Movements which are often followed across cuts rather than starting and ending within a single shot, so that they all feel existent in the same space. There are times where the visuals almost single-handedly hold our attention, like everything about the mechanical design of Violet's prosthetic arms, from her manual adjustment of the mechanisms that control them, to something as painstakingly skillfully animated as her fingers tapping the individual buttons on a typewriter for the first time, moments that seem crafted merely to express the extent of that animator's talents. But the thing is, that's never really the case. It's not detail for detail's sake. Whilst it may indirectly be putting the rest of the TV anime industry to shame before our very eyes, the passion to achieve such visuals does not stop at such a superficial purpose as just looking pretty. It goes a long way in improving the portrayal of various characters' emotions, in times where, rather than dedicating a large span of an episode to them, the better solution is to use a little bit of ambiguity based on our own interpretation of what a certain facial expression might mean. And these kinds of nuances in expression, or even how a character moves or holds themselves when sat in a chair, are not exclusively given to just Violet as the main character, or just the rest of the supporting cast. Someone with us for a single scene with less than a few sentences of dialogue, or even nameless civilians passing by in the street, feel so naturally and uniquely expressive as individual inhabitants of this world.
バイオレットちゃん、食べていいよ。
食べます。
All of this visual splendor can be attributed to Kyoto Animation's possession of various traits that unfortunately seem rare to the anime industry as a whole, if only for the fact that it clearly works wonders in producing stunning work. And this isn't a sentiment that starts and ends at Kyoto's dedication to animation. As a byproduct of giving a project the time and space to breathe, it attracts the talents of storyboarders, script writers, sound directors, and more, all equally as dedicated as the strongest of their animators. Give the project enough love and you find everyone working together to make it as good of an adaptation as is within their power, which it turns out goes as far as creating anime original episodes, inventing or expanding parts of the supporting cast that become welcome additions to improving the way the story is told. Specifically, I'm referring to how Violet's place of work and her co-workers in the auto memory doll and delivery departments are established as more integral parts of her character. This happens at the very beginning of the series, at which point we know barely anything about Violet's past, and it persists as a core component of the narrative to the very end, providing this area of foundation in support of Violet's development.
戻りました。何してんの？バイオレット。
Iris and Erica, whilst being near polar opposites in terms of personality, are likewise driven to fulfill personal objectives of their own as memory dolls, so that when they help Violet and the audience learn what this job entails, we get to see different perspectives on how a doll might transcribe the client's feelings, the purpose of such letters, and the meaning that can be derived from the act of writing them. Perhaps more immediately alarming is the conflict between the emotional intelligence required to write certain letters, which even Iris and Erica, as somewhat inexperienced dolls themselves, find difficulty in, and Violet's blatantly obvious lack of understanding any emotion.
どこが間違っていたのでしょうか。申し訳ありません。
Of understanding why someone might lie, or choose not to say what they really mean.
だからってあんたってほんと人の気持ちがわかんないのね。
It's a big problem when you come to realize how much of being a doll comes down to deciphering feelings even the client can't put into words. And that's really the crux of what Violet Evergarden is about. This series continues to follow this episodic structure after those first episodes where Violet becomes a certified auto-memory doll, and like how she learnt the basics of the profession with her co-workers whilst helping them come to certain realizations themselves, she travels the world meeting an assortment of different clients, and bit by bit, through helping them write these letters, she becomes more in tune with her own emotions, unbeknownst to herself, and much like many others during these post-war times, slowly reconciling with the trauma she went through on the battlefield.
お初にお目にかかります。自動式人形サービスバイオレット・エヴァーガーデンです。
Another anime original character, and one who was later added to the light novel, is Princess Charlotte, whom Violet spends an episode writing for as one of her first high-profile clients.
かけました。
And this episode also makes for an easily digestible example of this episodic structure. Like many, this episode walks a fine line between being from Violet's point of view as an observer of events and of barely being from her point of view at all, focusing almost entirely on the subject of her assignment, so that Violet becomes a supporting component of their story, until the end, where it becomes more apparent the impact working for them has had on her, or alternatively such things are sprinkled throughout a couple of key scenes from her one-on-one time with them. In the case of episode 5, Violet sets off on her assignment, travelling to a place as new to her as it is to us, meets the client whose wishes and needs exceed Violet's current capabilities as a doll, but they nevertheless overcome it by working together to find a suitable avenue in which their desire can be fulfilled, which we learn the significance of via flashbacks. And eventually, following a few bumps and bangs, Violet proves able to transcend the expectations one could have of any doll, let alone one with such a rudimentary understanding of emotion. Many of these episodes are stepping stones for Violet to find herself, providing windows for us to peer in at the key moments of the jobs she takes on that lead to a new stage in her development, which reflect back at us any relatable content as well. Between episodes features unknown passages of time, notable only by the visible changes she as a person exhibits between them, and episode 5 in particular feels like an especially large stepping stone, charting the beginning of Violet's career as a world-renowned auto-memory doll, and more importantly, her journey to understanding what love means. Princess Charlotte's story being one which most openly follows this, even if it's a different kind from the one Violet feels.
ねえ、今日本当にいい日ね。そう思わない？はい。良い結婚日和です。
In fact, her naivety regarding emotions makes the perfect excuse for these episodic stories being as melodramatic as they are. Persevering thanks to the fantastic presentation, they really require you to, at least to some degree, buy into the melodrama and the blatant emotional manipulation for it to have any impact.
戦争は残酷で相手を選ばないんだ。
If you do allow yourself to be subjected to this, then you'll notice the unusually successful contrast between exploration of nuanced facets of emotion and the not really shallow but somewhat underdeveloped stories. You have to simultaneously let the episode wash over you as a purely immersive experience whilst paying attention to the details that make it so, and I can only surmise that there's no clever narrative trickery involved in achieving this. The presentation alone is just that much of a carry that it comes naturally to you.
似ていますね。
Of course, being episodic, there's episodes viewers will regard as their most or least favourite, but there's not so many episodes in total that it ever feels inconsistent. Some stories just resonate with you more than others, and some are obviously designed to be harder hitting emotionally than others.
閉じ込められていた扉の向こうに歩き出す勇気を彼女がくれたのだから。
That being said, certain things did have to be sacrificed in order to fit each of these stories into singular 24-minute episodes.
ねえ。例の少佐のこと、あの子に話した？
いや。
最近のあの子、時々何か考え込んでるみたいだから。
Much of the subtlety expressed via the animation is, for the most part, thrown out of the window when it comes to the dialogue, in a bid to keep character progression and themes concise and unconfusing. There's a definite argument to be made that scenes featuring Violet conferring with her client are perfectly well suited to such on-the-nose dialogue, both out of the nature of her job and her own emotional inexperience. But scenes outside of that setup can feel uncharacteristically heavy-handed, in conflict with how the visuals want to portray things, such as the little changes in facial expression and movement, or the placement of a character within the frame.
オリーブに共感してくれてるんだ。君がそう感じてくれてほっとした。
Basically, they've gone down the route of giving some aspects subtlety and ambiguity, whilst others are a bit wink wink nudge nudge, here's what you need to know, now on to the next scene, feeling like we're meeting bullet points as a build up to some emotional payoff later on. The stories aren't really suited to be told over multiple episodes, and it would ruin the pacing of the series as a whole if they were, but because they are contained in single episodes, the stories sometimes lack the time to breathe, and lack time dedicated to how Violet specifically is affected by the job she has to do. There'll be snippets of Violet's incremental development at points during an episode, which again, the animation more than anything seems to carry in any way that calls for subtlety, but quite often does she become too ornamental for a character whose name is the title of the series.
主人公も観客も幸せになる。いや、してみせる。君は死んだ娘のいつかきっとを叶えてくれた。
いつかきっと。
It doesn't help that, excluding the anime original material and sequel films, Violet has minimal interactions with the only other cast members to persist across the series, meaning her interactions are predominantly with people who serve no further purpose and are never seen again beyond their standalone episode. If it weren't for the episodes actually centered around her, then it would seem more like how Mushishi treats its main character, where he's an ever-present figure of the world who goes from town to town observing and fixing the issues he finds there. But something like that wouldn't work in Evergarden's case, which has used Violet as an emotional blank slate for us to see certain emotions in their most raw form through eyes still learning to fully grasp them. Mushishi is more about the atmosphere of this calm fantasy world, whereas Evergarden is an exercise in how people experience and express emotions differently, and how those emotions should be presented to the audience to garner the most sympathy or empathy. If one thing's for sure, they definitely hit the mark bang on when it comes to that, with viewers reporting bawling their eyes out at more than a few episodes. This leads me onto something I haven't mentioned yet, something which, if good, works without fail to get the emotional juices pumping, and by itself is probably the most manipulative tool at anyone's disposal. Like Violet, even if the scenery may change, the music stays as a staple of emotional context that guides us throughout every episode. But a singular aspect holding such significance and control over the feeling of a scene isn't without its dangers.
翔さん、
生きて
いいのですか？
自由になりなさい。
武器として人を殺めてきた私が、それでいいのですか？
The music in Violet Evergarden has its moments of quiet and extravagance, but also obtrusiveness. For a series that most of the time acutely uses its music to great effect, to the point where rarely ever does a scene go by that does not include some part of the soundtrack, scenes that do choose not to can hold so much significance.
自分がしてきたことで、どんどん体に火がついて、燃え上がっています。生きているとおっしゃいましたよね。翔さんはご無事なのですよね。
それは。
生きていらっしゃるのですよね。
Having learnt that the Major, a figure of her upbringing and her guardian during the war, is not quite so alive as she had been led to believe, Violet gets hit all at once by what can only be summarised as a feeling of total loss. The loss of the life of the person she had been holding on to for all this time, the source of all positivity she experienced prior to starting work as a doll, and now that she has spent sufficient time learning the depth of her own emotions, she has gained the capacity to feel and understand as strongly as is evident in this scene. Her expectations that the Major would return, and the belief that it is on his wishes as her commander for her to continue living and working as she has been diligently doing, suddenly take a much darker turn. The good that has happened to her, the friends she's made, and the work she's done to help people in need are forgotten in this moment where she is forced to see the truth that her usual logical thinking had been ignoring. And so begins the arduous realization of all the loss she has caused, all the sadness that has come from her actions in battle where she killed dozens of soldiers. Soldiers who had loved ones of their own who will never get to see or speak to them again or send a final letter.
愛って何ですか？愛って何ですか？
This is where music and sounds accompany Violet's breakdown as she falls further into despair, and in this case I feel that the absence of music would have served to better amplify the distressing nature of the scene. Forced to watch and listen to the pain tormenting Violet as she tosses aside her possessions and bellows in rage and calls out for the Major into a room of near-silent ambience. Or at least that's how I wish it would be. It even starts out like this by showing her mind's eye vision of the scene of the Major's death. She tearfully imagines him being there in front of her, but the music quickly invades the scene and changes the tone from one of lament to anxiety.
ご無事だったのですね。
It's prematurely setting up for the Major's rejection of Violet proudly telling him about how she's been working as a doll.
多くの命を奪ったその手で
If the music hadn't been present, then the harsh reversal in his voice and the dreadful things he says to Violet would have been more surprising in their disturbance, as Violet has taken it back in shock, and then a sharp cut to her lying on the bedroom floor. But again, the music stays with us as a connection between dream and reality, never really overpowering the other sounds, just loyally, constantly there. We've heard it before, so it's not one that's unique to this scene, meaning it already has predetermined emotional implications attached to it, but just by listening, you can tell that it's out of place.
少佐、少佐。
Whilst damaging to the scene in question, it is still a rare occurrence, but that fact makes it all the more of a missed opportunity. They tiptoe the line constantly, usually to their favour, but in this unfortunate circumstance, their manipulative efforts stuck out like a sore thumb.
手紙だよ。バイオレット・エヴァーガーデン。どれ一つ取ったって誰かの大切な思いだからな。届かなくていい手紙なんてないんだ。
Using this anomaly to critique a series of otherwise near-total consistency, to try to find some reason why their blatant manipulative efforts shouldn't be as effective as they are, makes you feel like you're nitpicking. Ultimately, however, you have to concede that that manipulation is exactly what makes you care, and be unashamed that the emotional mark it leaves on you once it's all over is enough to get the better of any worthwhile criticisms you may have. Criticisms, many of which are not mistakes but deliberate exclusions of unrequired details that, if they had been included, would make the series bloated and mismatched with the core principles of the story, such as how it never pokes around too much about how Violet got into the hands of the military or what made her such an effective super soldier. The raised suspension of disbelief that comes from being animated and knowing that such tropes are at this point routine in anime makes it acceptable enough. Then there's Violet's mechanical arms, the technology behind them, and how they exist in this world. Or on a more personal level, the frustrations Violet would go through in becoming accustomed to using them, which is only briefly touched on at the start of the series. This in particular is mostly satisfied by there always being an air of sympathy whenever Violet reveals her arms to new acquaintances.
いただいたものなのです。少佐にいただいたものなのです。
An unspoken understanding of what a girl so young had to go through whilst being unable to mask their wonder at such a spectacle.
っぱりお人形だわ。
A girl who, dressed as close to a real-life doll as one could be, goes on to gracefully decipher their feelings by gently imprinting their words onto pages, and even though both parties involved may be unaware of it, onto herself as well. For many of Violet's clients, it's a life-changing interaction that they're sure to never forget. But for us, it's a sentimental juxtaposition to the ruthless killing machine we know she used to be. The anime always makes sure to keep some distance between us and Violet through breaks in her perspective, but her character is always there, building in different ways through her shared affinities and vulnerabilities with these clients. And Kyoto Animation and the writers of the light novel were surely triumphant in making us identify with someone whose childhood was and continues to be as far removed as could be from our own. It all leads up to a final couple of episodes that admittedly feel like an overly cinematic and obligatory climax, but which are dedicated to the purpose of finalising Violet's development, showing how differently she acts now by thinking for herself instead of blindly following direct orders, and taking into account her own wishes and feelings by choosing not to kill anyone else. Working as a doll, she's decided, is no longer just about following the final orders of the Major, but an important duty she has, to heal people in need with the arms that will always be a reminder of the people she killed. So whilst how Violet copes with her arms isn't thoroughly explored across the series, by the time her character has come fully to fruition, they stand, without need of exposition, as articulate symbols of the lingering scars of war, and how Violet has found a path down which she can overcome those scars and keep living.